That's great. Public session, the meeting to discuss a new common chapter. Before we begin, can I remind members, witnesses and persons in public gallery to turn off their mobile phones, including Jim Gibney down there. Members are requested to ensure that for the duration of the meeting their mobile phones are turned off completely or switched to airplane or safe or flight mode, depending on the device. It is not sufficient for members to just put their phones on silent modes, as this will maintain the level of interference with the broadcasting system. Also, I remind members of the long-standing parliamentary practice to the effect that they should not comment on, criticise or make charges against a person or body outside the Houses or an official either by name or in such a way as to make him, her or it identifiable. By virtue of Section 17, subsection 2L of the Defamation Act 2009, witnesses are protected by absolute privilege in respect of their evidence to the Joint Committee. If they are directed by the chairperson to cease giving evidence on a particular matter and continue to do so, they are entitled thereafter only to qualified privilege in respect of their evidence. They are also directed that only evidence connected with the subject matter of these proceedings to be given, and they are asked to respect the long-standing parliamentary practice to the effect that they should not comment on, criticise or make charges against a person, body outside the House or an official either by name or in such a way as to make it identifiable. I would like to formally welcome you to the following to our meeting today: Dr. Anthony Soares, Acting Director, Centre for Cross-Border Studies; Tara Farrell, Deputy CEO, Longford Women's Link; Louise Coyle, Director, Northern Ireland Rural Women's Network; and Edith Dixon, Policy and Parliamentary Manager in Gender. You're all very, very welcome. So the format of the meeting is that we will hear your opening statements before going into a question and answer session with the members. So I now call you to make your opening statement.
On behalf of the Centre for Cross-Border Studies and the other organisations here present today, I'd like to thank the Chair, Vice Chair and members of the committee for the invitation to meet with you to discuss the Towards a New Common Chapter project and the resultant new common charter for cooperation within and between these islands. And if the Chair's in agreement, I'd just begin by saying something about the Centre for Cross-Border Studies and the Towards a New Common Chapter project before Tara Farrell, Deputy CEO of Longford Women's Link, Louise Coyle, Director of Northern Ireland Rural Women's Network, and Ailey Dixon, Policy and Parliamentary Manager in Gender, tell you about their own organisations and their involvement in the project. But before doing so, I'd like to draw your attention to the new Common Charter for cooperation within and between these islands, of which you should have a copy, as this is really the ultimate reason why we're here today. So since its creation in 1999, the Centre for Cross-Border Studies has sought to contribute to the increased social, economic and territorial cohesion of the island of Ireland by promoting and improving the quality of cross-border cooperation. The Centre's pursuit of its mission has been framed by two primary public policy imperatives: the European Union's cohesion policy, with its focus on social, economic and territorial cohesion, and the commitment to cross-border and North-South cooperation integral to Strand 2 of the Good Friday Agreement. Throughout its existence, therefore, the Centre has been deeply concerned with community, social and economic development and cooperation, particularly on the island of Ireland, but also between the island of Ireland, Great Britain and beyond. This concern has informed the Centre's desire to initiate the Towards a New Common Chapter project. The project began in late 2014, and it has to be said it's been made possible with the generous support of the Joseph Rowntree Charitable Trust, Northern Ireland's Community Relations Council and the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade's Reconciliation Fund. The project has looked to support and inspire grassroots community commitment to cross-border cooperation in all its dimensions: cooperation at the border, wider North-South cooperation and East-West cooperation between the island of Ireland and Great Britain. It's worked towards a bottom-up vision of the importance and role of cross-border cooperation within and between these islands, whilst also noting the need for community groups to possess the necessary skills and capacity to not only engage in their own cross-border initiatives, but also to enter into more productive dialogues with relevant local, regional and central government policies and strategies. the result of a series of intensive conversations between a range of community groups from Northern Ireland and more recently with groups from England, Scotland and Wales, is a new common charter for cooperation within and between these islands that you should have before you. The new common charter represents a shared desire to maintain and strengthen relations between communities across these islands, to work together on issues of common concern and to advocate for the provision of the requisite structures and means to cooperate within and between these islands in whatever circumstances may arise. In light of this committee's specific role, and given that the sets of relations envisioned within the new Common Charter for Cooperation reflect the core strands of the Good Friday Agreement, we would ask members to support it and work with us in ensuring all administrations across these islands put in place policies and funding structures to encourage cross-border and cross-jurisdictional cooperation at grassroots community level. We hope that today's meeting will offer an opportunity to discuss the work undertaken as part of the Towards a New Common Chapter project and how members of this committee and political representatives more generally can champion the objectives of the new Common Charter for Cooperation. These are outlined in more detail in a series of recommendations within the supporting information provided to the committee, but they include how capacity building measures should be introduced to improve how all levels of government and public bodies across these islands engage with community organisations in the development of policies and strategies with a cross-border or cross-jurisdictional dimension, as well as the need for a comprehensive assessment of the current funding landscape for cross-border and cross-jurisdictional cooperation initiatives aimed at community organisations and what that landscape should look like going forward. Crucially, we would also like to see concrete support in advancing the work undertaken in the Towards a New Common Chapter project, bringing it to a wider audience and perhaps looking towards a platform for cross-border, cross-jurisdictional dialogue for community organisations that recalls the structure provided for governments and administrations across these islands through the British Irish Council. These are issues we may explore further during today's meeting, but I'll hand over now to Tara Farrell of Longford Women's Link.
Thanks, Anthony, and thank you, Chairperson and Committee, for the invitation. Longford Women's Link is a social enterprise founded in 1995, and we provide services to 900 women and 130 children approximately in Longford annually. And these services include education, entrepreneurship, community employment and a domestic violence service. And we deliver these services using our unique model of integrated service delivery. We also engage in widespread regional and national advocacy. Our CEO is on the board of the National Women's Council. I'm on the board of Irish Rural Link and the current chairperson of AINTHUS, which is the National Adult Learning Organisation, and also on the steering group of the Next Chapter, which is an Irish Rural Link and Politics Plus and NICFA initiative based in Stormont. One of our flagship programmes is the Women's Manifesto programme. It's a unique model of local democratic participation, which aims to support women in rural Ireland to play an active and meaningful role in their local decision-making structures. Just last week, we launched the SHE project with 50/50 Northwest Group, supported by the Department of Housing, Planning and Local Government. And this aims to change the face of local government in rural Ireland, supporting women to play an active role in public life. So the Women's Manifesto project was supported by the Joseph Rowntree Charitable Trust from 2012 until the cessation of the Trust's funding in the Republic in 2016. And Longford Women's Link and the Women's Manifesto programme have been active members of the Towards a New Common Charter initiative since 2015. And we see it as a key all-island programme of sustained engagement as we move beyond the Brexit referendum. We believe that working at grassroots level, as the new Common Charter most definitely does, is absolutely critical if we're to see meaningful cooperation and community development alongside an empowered civic society across these islands. And we've seen with Brexit what happens when civil society is largely excluded from central discussions. And we believe that the voices of grassroots women, especially in rural areas, not only need to be heard, but are essential in building inclusive and resilient communities. And we believe there's significant potential within the new Common Charter to do this. So briefly, if we are to have an effective democratic society that embodies the spirit of the Good Friday Agreement with active, engaged citizens and communities, then first of all, we need support for the new Common Charter, and secondly, support for civil society organisations. And yes, this does mean financial support, but we believe that it's an investment not only in our communities, but in the future of these islands. Thank you.
My name is Louise Coyle. I'm the Director of the Northern Ireland Rural Women's Network, and I thank you all for taking the time to listen to us today. The Northern Ireland Rural Women's Network is a membership organisation, so we are grassroots. We respond to what our members' needs are. And our overall mission is to try and influence key decision makers through providing a voice and representation for rural women, ensuring their equal and valued position in society. We seek to increase the voice of rural women at policy level, to advocate and lobby on behalf of rural women, to provide information and networking opportunities, to pilot innovative projects, which we consider this as an innovative project for rural women, and to hold statutory bodies to account to measure their impact of their decision making for rural women. We do this, among other things, by advocacy and organising local, regional networking events, providing information service to government departments, and supporting any organisation that wants to link with rural women and to hear what they need and what their concerns are. We're also a partner organisation in the North as part of the Women's Regional Consortium, which consists of 7 women's sector organisations who have come together to try and provide a voice for women from disadvantaged and rural areas. And we really are the rural element of that. The other organisations are based in Derry, Londonderry and Belfast. So it's critical that we get rural women at the table. We work in partnership with each other and our centres and groups really for the needs of women regionally. We've engaged in the New Common Chapter initiative because it's a grassroots effort to try and build and develop cooperation across our islands. And I think, as Tara said, Brexit has really brought it very clear how imperative that is and the implications that we're kind of dealing with now of not having had that in place. And taking account of historic barriers, and there's a lack of parity and gender representation across probably our island and certainly in the North. Women have been historically invisible, and even their work in terms of peace building to the position that we got to at the Good Friday Agreement has been largely written out of our very recent history as well. The development and emergence of community and civic leaders taking collective action to break silence, to share space for the greater good, requires leadership from within, as well as encouragement and support from external agencies and government like yourselves. Community development offers active and potentially active individuals a process and a route that they can use to lead and facilitate collective vision and action. Building peace in our rural areas and our communities is all about supporting the processes that leads to an absence of violence, conflict, the absence of fear, and flourishing economic and social and political justice in our rural areas, peaceful coexistence and the shared democratic use of power. And I suppose just even physically, rural people we feel are further away from the decision-making spaces, and it's much harder to get your voices and issues on how we experience differences and change in our areas. It's imperative that women in rural areas are listened to and supported so that their historic invisibility isn't mirrored in our post-conflict society. Thank you.
Thank you very much to the Chair and to the Committee for inviting me over from Scotland this afternoon to talk to you. I'll begin briefly with some comments about Engender and our work in Scotland. We are Scotland's feminist policy organisation, and we work to give effect to women's equality and rights at local, national and international level, to increase women's access to power, safety and resources, and to make visible the impact of sexism on women, men and society. With over 25 years' experience in gendered policy and advocacy, we are ambitious in our desires to build a Scotland which secures equality for all women and which works collaboratively with international and with Scottish partners. We work across a wide range of national policy portfolios to advocate for women's economic, social and political equality with men, including social security, justice, public space and political representation. Our Gender Matters Roadmap, which was published in 2017, sets out a series of measures that, with political will, can be taken by Scottish Government and other bodies in order to move towards women's equality in Scotland by 2030. Internationally, we also represent Scotland on the UK Joint Committee on Women, through which we work closely as a member of the European Women's Lobby. And in 2018, we worked to consult with women in Scotland and across the UK, as part of a shadow report to the UN Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. To that end, we worked with sister organisations both locally and across the UK and internationally as part of our Gender Matters Internationally portfolio to highlight women's inequality as a global concern. We became involved with the Towards a New Common Chapter in 2018 through our links with women's sector organisations both in the North of Ireland and in the Republic. Engender was asked to host a Scottish event for the project as part of its 4th stage in 2019, which focused on building support for the draft charter in community organisations in England, Wales and Scotland. At this grassroots session, women's organisations based in Scotland were presented with a draft and offered our thoughts on its scope and relevance to our experiences and priorities. Engender was then invited to an evaluation session held in Belfast in March 2019. I suppose we really value the process of the new Common Charter and its potential to further expand those networks that we've relied on so far and continue to do so, but also its potential to encourage grassroots collaboration on projects of shared importance, particularly women's equality. Particularly in the context of Brexit and the potential for further devolution, partnership working enables us to learn from one another's activities and our successes. We already appreciate the opportunity to share space for discussion with communities, grassroots and other civil society organisations with shared ambitions and from other sectors in a forum which promotes collaboration, sustained engagement and critical expertise.
Okay, thanks very much. Frank, you were first in. Does anyone else want anything?
I'll turn my phone off. Sorry about that. First of all, you're very, very welcome, and I've met a few of you before. Anthony, you're very welcome, and Tara, coming from Roscommon, I know the work that you do, great work you do in Longford, but you're very, very welcome, and this is great news. I think this is very, very welcome, a common charter, because we've taken our relationships for granted, north, south, east and west, and I think Brexit has brought a huge realisation that we are very, very close, but there's a lot of hurt that has been caused by Brexit and a lot of issues need to be repaired. Just looking at the Charter, valuing the musical, literary and artistic and cultural traditions, and we've seen those expressions and through sporting and various issues. And there was one thing that, you know, despite tens of thousands where I come, and where I come from, Middle Ireland, the west of Ireland, every second house has somebody has worked in the UK, has relations to the UK, and it's something that we just again take for granted. As you go to Knock Airport, we have 15, 16 flights daily, nearly just from Knock Airport, and it's something we took for granted. And one thing I noticed was when the Queen came to Ireland in 2011, you know, the British Irish Chamber of Commerce was set up after centuries of trade. The British Irish Chamber of Commerce set up in 2011, and it's gone from strength to strength, and you have the London Irish Construction Network set up. So we've begun to effectively mobilise but understand that a trade and sporting, cultural, religious links, north, south, east and west, you know, and this is, again, this is very welcome. Just one issue it's something that's back in my mind. You know, I think, and I'll be political here, I think Mark Durkan running for Fine Gael from Derry, I think it's very, very welcome, you know, because it's something that it brings an influence. And I see my colleague here, Niall O'Donnell, you know, from East Belfast in the Senate, he brings a flavour, you know, to our Seanad, which is very, very welcome. And we also have the first unionist has been put into the Seanad over a year ago, Ian Marshall. And what I have noticed, and I think Niall can speak for himself, he has brought people to the Republic or to the House of the Oireachtas that otherwise wouldn't interact with our Parliament or with the, and I really think from a political, and one thing you've left out from a political level, and I'll just come up with a few ideas. I think the Seanad or the Upper House is probably the most suitable vehicle to get those ideas and to meet like-minded politicians. And Chair, I know we're in at the British Irish Parliamentary Assembly. What has gone on there? Every 6 months we meet at a plenary and we have politicians from all the various parliaments. But I'll be a little bit, I won't say provocative, but it's an idea that I feel, you know, you maybe it's time now to have a second assembly or a second parliament or Seanad in Stormont. I know it's not up and running, but maybe it's time to invite members of the Irish diaspora. You have Billy Lawless from the States, but from the UK, doesn't have to be from an Irish background, but doesn't have to be from an Irish background. Maybe it's somebody that represents the British Labour Party, Conservatism, and maybe, you know, maybe it's time now for maybe the Scottish Parliament or the Welsh Parliament to look at an upper house, because I think that by bringing in those politicians, and maybe it's time for somebody, and you know, maybe it's time for somebody from the Republic to sit in the House of Lords. I know it might sound, but at least you're getting those relationships built up. And what I have noticed from chair of the British Irish Parliamentary Assembly, the goodwill that's there despite Brexit amongst UK politicians towards the island of Ireland is there. I know there's a few that don't understand, but the goodwill that's there, and I think it's something that, and the goodwill in our Oireachtas towards the North and Northern Ireland and the UK is there. And I think maybe it's an opportunity, maybe you've left it out. I'd just ask your opinion on it. I know it can be controversial, and some parties won't take their seats in Westminster, and that's a matter for them. You know, I'm not commenting, that's a matter for them, and I respect that. But I think there's an opportunity here from a political dynamic, especially after Brexit. And as I said, we have seen the great work the British Irish Parliamentary Assembly have done, and we have committees. But again, I shudder to think, after 20 years or 21 years, effectively, of the Good Friday Agreement, I really think now we need to move from a political level, and I'd maybe ask your opinion.
Well, it's drifting a bit from the agenda, but you know, I know the headline is for cooperation within and between these islands, but I don't know. You know, if the group itself is uncomfortable in relation to the question, you know, you don't have to answer it. But like, clearly, we're here to discuss cooperation, and if you feel that's the way forward, you know, it's part of that discussion. But I presume others would have a different view. I think there's also other structures there that clearly, look, as a committee, we've had some of the groups, the partnerships that are operating north and south into this committee. We had the Northwest in just a while ago, and again, this would be a structure that's made up of councillors from both sides of the north and south. And again, I think we all found that a lot of the work that they're doing, really positive work, they're signal, you know, what areas of cooperation that needs to be followed through. And I suppose one of the questions I'd have in relation to that is, you know, do you feel the likes of those groups are worthwhile? Frank mentioned British Irish Parliamentary Assembly. I think a lot of us would be frustrated that, you know, that we're not really engaging with many of the, you know, the communities that we represent, those different jurisdictions. There's a sense that it might be a bit stale. You know, we might have to look at those structures and so on, but particularly with those ones that are operating cross-border at the moment, they're coming up with really positive solutions in relation to cooperation or economic development. You know, road structures that I mean there. Do you feel that, again, is there something that both governments need to be doing in relation to those structures that are actually operating at the moment? Everyone looks at what's not happening, but what's actually happening on the ground. Do you feel that, you know, they're worthwhile? And, you know, do you feel that they should be enhanced? And, you know, is there follow through that should be, you know, in relation to what supports are needed and so on? And are you picking that up in relation to many of those groups that you're meeting yourselves? Do you want to come in? No. Okay. Do you want to respond to that?
Okay, thank you. In terms of the Senator's question around the political element and the suggestion that might be perhaps missing within the new Common Charter for cooperation within and between these islands, there was just two things I'd like to stress on that one. This really is a grassroots charter produced by community organisations, so it's their kind of vision around how they want to cooperate and the value that they place on cooperation. That's the first thing I would say. I would also, the second thing I would say in terms of what already exists in terms of the institutions that are there that were created under the Good Friday Agreement, the British Irish Council, the British Irish Parliamentary Interparliamentary Conference, but also structures like the British Irish Parliamentary Assembly, which we will be addressing actually in this plenary session we will be presenting the new Common Charter on Monday to the British Irish Parliamentary Assembly, and we're really looking forward to that. One of the things I would say around those structures is that perhaps they haven't been exploited to their full potential by one or both governments or perhaps even some of the administrations that are involved. I would remark on the fact that in terms, for example, of if we look at who actually takes part, who leads the delegations into the British Irish Council, for example, who is it that leads the Scottish government, who leads the Welsh government, who leads when the Northern Ireland government is in operation, who leads that, who leads the representation from the Irish government, and we look at who leads the UK government representation into the British Irish Council. It seems to me, it gives me the impression not enough importance is given to that structure by one of those governments, that the others are, they send their highest representatives in order to take part in those structures. But one of the things I would also say in terms of these channels for cooperation, so there are those institutions, those channels that exist for parliamentarians to cooperate, to engage in dialogue, which the Senator points out is absolutely essential, that there are those opportunities for that north-south and east-west dialogue to take place amongst all parliamentarians, absolutely vital. But if we take the civic society, the civil society, and the opportunities for that type of dialogue to take place at civil society level, we don't see that happening. The Good Friday Agreement had within it the Northern Ireland Civic Forum, which disappeared, replaced lately with the six-member Civic Advisory Panel, which I don't think it might have met once or twice, but then obviously since the institutions stopped functioning, hasn't met. So going from a Northern Ireland Civic Forum to a six-member Civic Advisory group doesn't seem to me to really give us much of a platform there for civic society dialogue within Northern Ireland. The All-Ireland Consultative Forum that was suggested in the Good Friday Agreement, which then the St Andrews Agreement actually pointed out this is something that had to come about. We're still waiting for the All-Ireland Civic Advisory Platform, so that All-Ireland dimension, allowing civic society to enter into that dialogue the same way that parliamentarians do. And the other thing that I would point out is that perhaps it was a sign of the times. It was just the Good Friday Agreement was written at that stage. When you got to Strand 3, you have the British Irish Council, but there was no suggestion that there should be an equivalent platform as there is the Northern Ireland Civic Forum, All Ireland Civic Consultative Forum, but no suggestion that there should be an All Ireland's Forum for civic society. So that's perhaps a gap there that we could perhaps address, and that this Common Charter could be perhaps something that could start that process thinking. So that's all I would point out, that this is really a grassroots community organisation vision for cooperation, rather than looking at the political structures which I think already exist and could be exploited even further.
Anyone else want to come in? No?
Very briefly, I think to echo what Anthony said, there has been no other space for us. And bearing in mind that this project has been in existence since 2014 and we started our involvement in 2015, so if there isn't this platform, then we don't get that shared understanding of the issues facing communities right across the islands. And what we've found over the last number of years is that many of our challenges, many of our issues, many of our hopes, many of our fears are very much shared. And I think that's why a grassroots platform like this is so important, in order to allow those opportunities to collaborate for the benefit of our communities.
Francis? Yeah. Sure, go on.
I was just going to add what Tara said, because we came into the project quite a bit later. There was a draft charter already developed that was the sort of north and south element. I absolutely will not be so bold as to make any kind of comment as to the Scottish political structure's involvement in any of this, but from a civil society perspective, particularly given asymmetric devolution within the UK, it's just been such a valuable experience to be able to talk to other women's organisations. The patriarchy doesn't stop at the border. We do share similar challenges, but often in very different contexts, and that learning is really, really valuable for our work.
Frances.
Thank you so much for coming in today and for your presentations. And I'm sad to say I wasn't aware of the great work that you're doing, and it sounds brilliant. I mean, the essence of what you're doing is so important around bringing, you know, working cross-border, cross-community, bringing communities together. And, you know, I mean, I know myself, even just from going up north and going into the different communities, that the reality is, you know, basic human people are, you know, they all have the same issues, you know, homelessness and unemployment and mental health issues, and, you know, and obviously then within the north itself you have, you know, and I'm always talking about the intergenerational trauma, the mental health, and all of those issues that people are dealing with, you know, on a daily basis. And these are huge issues. They're absolutely huge. And, you know, and I know I've given this example here in this committee before where, you know, the charitable organisation that I'm involved with, we ran a cross-border, cross-community group, but it was specifically around families who have been impacted by addiction. Now, not the person in addiction, but family members who have somebody they love. And what I was blown away. I mean, I sat in on that programme, and so we had the two different communities coming together, and then we had people, you know, cross-border, people from down south. And what was really interesting, and what I learned, was at the end of the day, initially there was a bit of friction between, you know, the people from the two different communities, you know, but when we worked through that, it was amazing how they came together, because at the end of the day they were both grieving. But what I realised is, you know, from people who were from the south had no idea of the impact of the conflict and the intergenerational trauma and, you know, the deaths, the people who died, and then you have the huge suicides that's happening now, and it's, I mean, that I was actually involved in another event in North Belfast where the communities came together around families who'd lost loved ones to suicide, and at the end of the day the heartbreak was exactly the same. You know, the devastation, the intergenerational trauma that comes from the conflict was exactly the same. And, you know, and it sounds like that's the essence of what you're trying to do. You know, it's about bringing, you know, civil society together. And I think it's the way forward. I really do. It's connecting into what people, the anxieties and the problems and the worries that people have on a day-to-day basis, from whatever that issue might be, and it's looking at what those issues are, and bringing people together in that way. And I've seen it myself. I've actually done programmes, and I've seen how it works, and I've seen how the two communities come together through that heartache, you know, and how somebody can find empathy, who've gone through the same thing, but find empathy for each other. And I really do believe it works. So I suppose what my question is then, and again, the area that I'd be coming from my perspective, is that intergenerational trauma, the mental health, the impact, you know, from it around mental health, around addiction. In your work that you do, and I know there's a lot of organisations who are doing it, but from your work, how do you, or is there something that you do within that area, if that makes sense? I hope that makes sense to you. I hope that question makes sense. But is there something that you do around, say, intergenerational trauma or, you know, addiction, mental health? Is there anything you do in that area?
Hiya, Frances. In Nirwan, we work regionally across the north with rural women and rural women's organisations, and obviously post-conflict we're dealing with all kinds of issues that you outlined there. One of the things that we would find that as well as all of that, people are suffering social isolation as well, and the mental health impacts of that if you're living rurally. And we have been really, in our jurisdiction anyway, we're dealing with a lack of investment in resourcing that. The money is just not there. We have no government at the minute to appeal to redress that. I know they really were looking at the health service very seriously, looking at that, and there does seem to be a plan in place, but the plan can't be executed at the minute when we have no government in place. But that doesn't mean that real people are still dealing with their real issues. And then on top of that, we have all the Brexit implications in terms of access to service. And if you're living in a border area, sometimes the services that you wish to access are maybe not on your side of the border. You know, we've got good at that, moving around, and we're used to being able to work, to live, to traverse our island freely, and our members are very clear that, you know, there's no good news in Brexit for them, and they want to continue to live their lives the way they've always lived them, and that includes being able to access those services. If you've already rurally isolated, you're dealing with the mental health impacts of that on your family, and for women, if they're impacted, their entire family's impacted, or if someone in their family's impacted, it impacts on them. So, and it is that intergenerational, even, you know, we're part of a historically patriarchal society, which the care and responsibilities for members of families fall to women. Very much so, particularly in rural areas, and the burden of that as well, of trying to care for people, whether it's addiction or suicidal thoughts or, you know, mental health issues. And we are, as an organisation, to come back to your question, you know, our job is to try and support them, to link them to the services that are there, but they have all those frustrations that I've just outlined. And I suppose the point of bringing it back to what can the Charter do about that? Well, they can't sort the health service and they can't do any of that, but what we can do is maybe talk to the likes of Longford Women's and say, well, where are you getting your help from and what has worked for you? And we can talk and see what's happening in Scotland, well, what's working there? And, you know, in terms of gender equality and things, I would say Scotland are way ahead of us on that. So, you know, where is the learning and how do we distill that learning? And then as an organisation whose job is to amplify the voice of our members, then I would consider it's my job then to try and talk to all of you and whoever else can be in a situation to make a change for that. We can't change it, we can just try and get the information and the support to our members. So hope that's not a really unwieldy answer, but that's the gist of what we do.
Jessica, comment, Senator, in response, you mentioned the fact that you weren't aware of the great work that was. There's a reason for that. It started in late 2014, and the work with community groups started then in the beginning of 2015, but we deliberately kept this quiet, low profile, because we wanted to give people that space, the opportunity to actually have those conversations, exchange views, and sometimes have some difficult conversations around what cross-border cooperation meant for them, what the border means for them, depending on their life experiences and their particular backgrounds. They have very different experiences. If you come from a rural community group, sometimes you might belong to what you think is the same community of identity, but you live in a rural area, and the other group lives in an urban setting, and although you think you share the same identity, in fact you're very different, and so sometimes you're having these difficult conversations within the same kind of community, but rural versus urban. So it involved a lot of difficult conversations, but I think it was absolutely vital that we did that, because one of the things we're trying to do with this was assess to begin with. It wasn't coming up with this vision for cooperation. First of all, it's seeing, do people actually believe, value the thought of cooperation? Do they actually want to cooperate in the first place? Because if we jump straight away to this vision and miss out on the willingness, the attitudes to cross-border cooperation, then we end up perhaps with something that's superficial, artificial, that doesn't really have the real support behind it. And that's why you wouldn't have heard of this, because we were trying to keep a lot of this conversation happening in the background quietly.
Sure.
Just to echo what Anthony said, and also, Senator, your comment about, you know, people having the same issues. And as Anthony says, a lot of the conversations we had weren't necessarily easy ones, but from our perspective, you know, and I think ourselves and Irwin started our involvement in the project around the same time, there was a huge amount of willingness on behalf of participants to listen and to engage and to really learn from each other. And, you know, we're in a post-Brexit, whatever that will look like, situation now, and the impact that that's going to have on women, particularly rural women. And, you know, we're now working on various different levels and various different projects. And, for example, we've spoken at, you know, a NIWEP 5 Nations seminar on the economic impact of Brexit on women, speaking about things that perhaps aren't always talked about in the mainstream. So the impact on women who are experiencing domestic violence in terms of post-Brexit, what's that going to look like in terms of barring orders and jurisdictions and so on. So while, you know, the conversations haven't always been easy, I think they've been at all times very respectful, and I think we have had a great willingness to exchange information and good practice.
Okay. Yeah.
One other ask, from your perspective, what would you like from us today? And, you know, what would you like us to do for you, the committee? That's the first question. And then if you had Simon Coveney sitting in front of you today, what would you ask him?
So, in answer to the first question, what we would like to ask members of this committee to do is to look at the Charter carefully, see if you agree with it, can you support it, and enter into conversation with other members of these houses here. Spread the message, because what we're looking for ultimately when we come looking for it is whatever happens in terms of Brexit, whatever kind of Brexit we have, or whether we even have Brexit at all, is absolutely vital that the structures are there and that the funds are there in order to support cooperation at the community level on a north-south basis and all-island basis, but also on an east-west basis, because what we don't want to end up seeing is a situation where the structures aren't there and the funds aren't there, and those funds have to come from all administrations across these islands. So it's not just the Irish government, and here I would just make a quick aside. If you take away EU funding from the situation and you look what is there, what funds actually support cross-border cooperation outside of EU funds, one of the ones that immediately comes to mind is the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade Reconciliation Fund. If you take that out of the equation, what are you left with? You are left with very few charitable organisations. For example, the Joseph Rowntree Charitable Trust, it does fund what we do. The Northern Ireland Community Relations Council does support what we're doing, and so we welcome that. But outside of that, there is no equivalent, direct equivalent from the UK government side. There hasn't been one from the Northern Ireland government side either, equivalent to the Reconciliation Fund. So that is a glaring deficit. So that has to be addressed. And again, I'll quickly point out in terms of what's coming from the UK government side, we've been following very closely their development of the UK Shared Prosperity Fund, which is the UK government's proposal to replace EU structural funds. And the very little detail that there is there, and there's still very little detail, they seem to have forgotten that structural funds support cross-border cooperation. And even though the border on the island of Ireland is mentioned every 2 seconds and the backstop every other second in terms of the Brexit debate, when they're sitting there formulating a new policy, they forget once again that there is a border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, and between the island of Ireland and Great Britain, and that UK Shared Prosperity Fund should be able to support cross-border cooperation. So we would request that members from this committee enter into dialogue with other politicians here, but also use their contacts with politicians in Westminster, in Holyrood, in Cardiff Bay, and to make sure that everybody is aware of this and of that need going forward.
Thank you. Francie?
Thank you very much for the presentation. And,
someone else want to go in? Sorry. Sorry. On the same thing, come on.
Sorry, yeah, I just wanted to just add to that this project preceded the whole Brexit debacle, and I think that is because community organisations and grassroots organisations like ourselves could see that these kind of activities were not priorities for our governments, and that includes you, I'm afraid. And because there was no mechanism in place really for us to engage at that level to get those issues across, I think Brexit has really kind of distilled it maybe for everyone, how for granted we took that everything would be fine and sure we all get along and sure it'll be all grand. And we now know that that is really not the case, and why it is so important to have defined and absolute structures in place that we follow, and that there are things in place to allow these things to happen and to ensure that they happen, because goodwill and visions and great hopes are all very well, but actually you can see when it comes down to it that actually, I mean, we have our Good Friday Agreement, and as Anthony has outlined, there have been very key bits of that neglected and not delivered upon. I mean, we should have had a Bill of Rights for Northern Ireland, which would really have helped certainly our sector quite a lot in the face of Brexit, but it's not there. And you know, it's about that keeping that energy to deliver on those things. And I think the fact was it was missing, and that's why we started this work. And I think we maybe were a bit prophetic in terms of, I don't think any of us wished for Brexit, but we could see that there were gaps there in terms of structural support and the energy and commitment by governments behind that structural support. And I was in front of Simon Coveney around the Brexit stuff, and what I did say to him was, you know, I know that politically things are, you know, have to be done carefully, but it is not political overreach to deliver on the Good Friday Agreement, because you are co-guarantors of the Good Friday Agreement, and, you know, as such you have a responsibility to all of us as citizens to deliver on that, and that, I think, is underneath a lot of the issues that were raised in the Charter.
Anyone else want to get? Francie?
Okay, we'll go again. First of all, you're very welcome, and thank you very much for coming and making the presentation. The one thing that you say, the Good Friday Agreement does provide for many of the things that we are talking about, and many things that are missing, and we are part of the implementation of the Good Friday Agreement. And unfortunately, both governments actually seem to ignore that it hasn't been fully implemented yet, and no efforts really been made to do it. I think there's a danger all the time of just keep making new organisations to do the job that the original organisation was supposed to do and didn't. So I think the opportunity for Civic Forum in the future, the All Ireland Civic Forum as well, within the Good Friday Agreement is a very important aspect that hopefully will come out of the discussions that are happening at the moment, and try to develop that. The Intergovernmental Forum, as we've heard, is there, but not fulfilling the role. Many of these organisations were supposed to step in when there was a crisis, but actually instead of stepping into the crisis, they actually saw themselves as developing the crisis, so they didn't do anything. So I think it is important that grassroots has a say to ensure that everything is continuing and happening, to make the development of the Civic Forum as one aspect. The Common Charter, I know we're listening here on the line of women's organisations, but I assume that it is covering a wider aspect than just women's organisations. I would hope that, because us men are starting to get feeling isolated. But it is very important, I think, that what we do see it as the cross-border dimension, and the studies that have been done in various different ways are coordinated together to try and maximise that discussion right across the board. Because people feeling isolated, and maybe the Scottish experience is worthwhile as well from our point of view, because the fears that actually are out there within the community as regards a border poll, a referendum and Irish unity, are all there, and the experience that Scotland has is that you can have a referendum on independence, and it comes and goes, and you might go for another one. So how do you actually allay some of those fears that are within the community, that instead of actually them saying there's a problem or fear, that we actually open up and try to actually manage the change that actually is happening, and change that will happen right across the board. So I think the Common Chapter is a good way of actually to work within it, and to try and get across between the two governments, and also with emerging assembly, hopefully in the near future, that actually would develop that and be there as a testing pool for the views and ideas that actually have, and that do become a challenge to the Assembly, a challenge to councils, I think, as well, because there's a lot of good work going on within all of the new councils, and they're just re-elected there. And I think a lot of the good work has been done there, and resources that are there to actually try and develop with the councils to come up with new ideas of how to manage the change that's actually there. And sometimes if the councils can do it, then it's easier maybe for the other organisations to do it, other structures to do it, and the institutions within that. We do have, as you were saying before, and Frank covered some of the things that are there, but unfortunately there's a lot of talking shops, and there's a lot of intergovernmental meetings which don't seem to have in the last 20 years have actually delivered very much, except that people are meeting, and that's good in itself. But I think at this stage we actually now need to get to the stage where there's delivery, and that we shouldn't be talking at this stage about the issues that were there at the time of the Good Friday Agreement, but how do we actually develop beyond the Good Friday Agreement? So thank you very much for the initiative, and hopefully we can tie in with that at local level and meet with you on that situation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. In terms of the representation of women's groups on the development of the Common Charter, it just so happens that there were two primary target groups that we had as a Centre for Cross-Border Studies when we started going down this road. One was women's groups, and the other one was the PUL community along the border as well. We thought if we're going to get a real vision for cooperation and really test the appetite for cross-border cooperation, let's try and speak to some of those people that perhaps might not have an automatically positive outlook to it. Let's actually start with some more challenging groups in one sense. And in terms of the women's groups, we've responded to consultations on Ireland's National Action Plan for Section 1325 or UN Security Council Resolution 1325, and we've always pointed out that women's groups and women have always been at the forefront of peace and reconciliation processes here on the island of Ireland, but don't necessarily see that translated then into how policy is developed and how it's shaped and to what extent it meets its needs. So that was the reason we wanted women's groups. But yes, there are other groups involved in the development of the Common Charter. So that's one thing. The other thing, in terms of, I won't necessarily say anything about the Scottish referendum or the border poll in terms of allaying people's fears around that, but dialogue. Whatever comes down the track, if people are talking to each other, community groups of all shapes and sizes, north, south and east, west, if we're talking to each other, then we can confront all sorts of challenges and seize all sorts of opportunities. But in order for us to do that, we have to be talking to each other. Because one of the things we actually saw as we were doing this project is the actual lack of knowledge that we have of one another. 20 years after the Good Friday Agreement, we still don't know how we live. Who governs in our various jurisdictions? Who is the First Minister of Scotland? No idea. Who's the First Minister? No idea. Who's the Taoiseach? No idea. There is that lack of knowledge of political structures is one thing. So we have to overcome that and continue that conversation. And that brings me to the Scottish representation on this project and in the development of the new Common Charter, as well as the Welsh and the English, although the English is a bit more difficult, a bit more challenging. But the Good Friday Agreement binds us all together, and that's one of the things we actually wanted to get across as well. It's cooperating, it's the Good Friday Agreement, but the Good Friday Agreement is not just about a corner of the island of Ireland, and it's not just about the island of Ireland. It brings everybody together. We're all part of it. So our Scottish friends are as much part of the Good Friday Agreement, our Welsh friends are as much part of it, and we're all co-guarantors of the Good Friday Agreement. Obviously, the ultimate responsibility is for the two governments, the Irish and the UK government. They are the co-guarantors. But we shouldn't just wash our hands of it and just let them get on with it, and then we arrive at those moments of crisis. We should avoid those moments of crisis and know when those moments of crisis are coming down the tracks. If we all take responsibility for being co-guarantors of that agreement and making it a living document, not just a piece of paper, actually making it live. So our Scottish friends, our Welsh friends, our English friends are also part of that, and not to forget the Isle of Man and the Channel Islands as well.
I won't touch on the current state of Scottish constitutional discussions, but what I will say is that whatever happens, there's already a considerable amount of similarities and differences, and those are different as in between the different devolved areas and the UK and between Ireland. And so I think the important aspect is to have as many forums as possible where we can share these conversations in the most appropriate setting, and that those are accessible for small organisations as well. Engender is a national organisation, but we facilitated some of the grassroots organisations in Scotland to become involved in the Charter. And I think that what that process added, and perhaps Tara and Anthony can speak to this a bit more, is the influence of the different contexts, the different ways in which we use language in our political system, the different narratives that we use. And I think that you can see the influence of that between the draft versions of the Charter, even though the content was quite similar. It took some additional work to make it relevant and usable for all of those areas. So I suppose, just to finish on that thought, the kind of common problems that Louise maybe referred to around that we share in the concept of gender inequality, care, access to resources, the use of services and the potential impacts when those are cut. Again, they don't stop at the border, but they do have different, and quite rightly, different connotations and different frameworks around them.
I suppose when you're speaking about language, we had, after quite a few of the all-island and cross-border meetings and workshops, we had a draft before we went to Scotland. Was the first meeting that we had, and it was when we got the comments in terms of the language that we'd used. We'd spent a lot of time talking about culture, for example, and culture will have very different connotations in different parts of these islands. So it's been really, really positive and really important to have those discussions in Scotland, in Wales, in England, because we have to reflect what's happening for communities across the islands. And just another brief point there, Anthony was talking about responsibilities and within community organisations, and going back to for example, the National Action Plan on Women, Peace and Security, specifically referencing the underrepresentation of women in political structures as having an impact on peace building and reconciliation. And within the manifesto model, it's something that I suppose we feel we have a responsibility to support women, not just to participate in structures and participate in public life, but to understand the structures. And we think that's something that's really, really important right across communities, and no matter what kind of groups, whether it's youth groups or cross-community groups, that if people don't understand the local decision-making structures, the regional, the national decision-making structures, it's very difficult for them to even see where they can have a voice. And I think that's something that we have always held on to very strongly, and we think that it's a really, really important element of the Common Charter going forward.
Okay. Anyone else?
Just wondering on the of the cross-border training, and it applies to everything you'd say education. I often thought that we need some sort of a system of the training within schools, within education regards the structures that actually govern everywhere, because young people, particularly on the end of not participating at a very early. The younger we get people to participate, the longer they're probably going to be more involved with them. But also in the line of the part of my own constituency, in Ulster, the whole issue about apprentices and training, and it applies cross-border. But one of the problems we're having at the moment is you actually can't get workers, whereas before unemployment was the big issue, but now it's getting to a stage where we need training and need apprenticeships to actually to fill the vacancies that are coming in. So I think one of the things of the cross-border aspect that would be beneficial if we could get established by the two governments the opportunity of apprenticeships in engineering right across the board in the different skills that are required within that, which would actually be positive and delivering in the cross-border corridor within that.
Thank you for the question, Andrew. Before I answer, on just behalf of my colleague here, Ailey Dixon, unfortunately, because she's joined us here today from Scotland, she has to scoot off now to Sophie, if the committee is okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. In terms of what you've just been raising, young people's groups that were involved in the development of the first draft of this charter, one of the things that they pointed to was the fact that they felt that they were undervalued if they did not choose a university degree as their pathway in terms of education. If they chose anything that was outside of that, that they were seen as of lesser value. So they talked about the need. So this is groups from North and South, young people talking about that attitude and how that has to change, and how that there has to be more emphasis, more value given to those vocational qualifications, alternative paths to different careers, and that we shouldn't obsess, which is the young people are saying on both sides of the border. That's what we obsess with, is degrees, and you must get a degree, and they don't feel valued. And I do think there's opportunity to cooperate on a north-south basis in terms of apprenticeships, in terms of training, and employers are talking about the same issues in terms of labour force and skills, and we are, as an island, and as islands, we are going to be facing huge challenges in terms of the skills that are going to be needed in the future economy, not in the next 5, 10, 15, but in the next 20 years. What are we going to need, and how are we going to achieve those goals? And cooperation is one of those the ways that we can achieve that at a lesser cost for everybody.
Louise?
I just say I'm from Mid-Ulster myself, Francie, and you know, one of the issues as well with employment is actually where is it based? You know, and how far are people having to travel, and is there the infrastructure in order to get them there to and from work and to and from education and apprenticeships? And when you're talking about young women, how apprenticeships are actually sold, as it were, to young women, and what opportunities there are. I am obviously of the view that a young woman should be doing engineering as much as a young man should be, but we still have a ways to go on that in terms of trying to promote that, even with within businesses and organisations, as well as to young women themselves. And structurally, the barriers that there are for young rural women, particularly if they've got any kind of caring responsibilities and to try and to reduce those whilst we're offering the opportunity, making sure that there's actually not any barriers in place that's preventing them from accessing that opportunity, and that includes really very much where it's located. We are a small place, but sometimes it feels very big when you're trying to get from one place to another, and there's nothing, there's no infrastructure there to enable you to do that.
Sarah? Sarah, do you want to go in? No? Okay.
One of the things you spoke about in relation to the graduation, and a young person pointed out to me that when you go into nearly everybody's house, the photographs on the wall of the person who graduated, there's no photograph on the wall of the fitter or welder or the painter or decorator, and we have to find some way of recognising those skills and trades, because they're probably more important to deliver.
I think as well as their picture being on the wall, they are probably not anywhere near their home. If their picture's on that wall, they've probably had to go to, you know, somewhere bigger to try and get paid appropriately for that degree they got.
Because I've been very remiss. There have been a couple of opportunities for me to actually highlight the really good work, including in terms of economic development, training opportunities done by local authorities, and in particular the local authority-led cross-border networks. I think their work is absolutely vital in this, and that they need to be supported in doing that going forward. So I just wanted to take the opportunity to say that.
Okay. Well, I'm going to... Do you just want to sum up, or...?
Could I just make a quick comment about cross-border cooperation? Has been very largely resourced and supported by the EU. And I know certainly our members are quite concerned as to how is that community infrastructure and how is that level of support into rural communities going to be resourced in the future. So I suppose there's a challenge for us all within that. It's not just for yourselves, but you know, the things that are working well and have been working well, we potentially are at risk of losing those things in the future. And so we want to be building and not going back.
And just to follow on from that, and here again I would ask for this committee and their support and continue this dialogue, because if we have what has been promised in terms of a Peace Plus programme, this has been the commitment made by the European Commission. It's been a commitment made by the Irish Government in terms of a Peace Plus programme to replace the current Interreg and peace programmes, even if there is a no-deal Brexit, that there is a dialogue that happens with community organisations in terms of what that Peace Plus programme might represent and how it's to support cross-border cooperation at grassroots community level. Because in terms of the dialogue that's been going on around Brexit, A lot of the focus has been on the economic consequences of Brexit and how cross-border trade might be affected, and it's not always really apparent that the same level of attention has been made to how it's going to affect cross-border relations between communities in the grassroots community level, which is absolutely essential to be maintained. Otherwise, the lifeblood of the Good Friday Agreement will really disappear if we're just left with an economic dialogue around the Good Friday Agreement rather than one that includes communities.
Okay, on behalf of the committee, can I thank you for coming in and giving your presentation. I think listening to the members, there's clearly support here in relation to your charter. I suppose the next question is how we can move it forward. I think, you know, you've asked members to talk to other members of not only this House but wherever Oireachtas or wherever they come from, and talk and encourage. I think we all agree that dialogue is the way forward. Clearly, if you disagree with someone, the only way you're going to change that person's point of view is by actually sitting down and talking with them. I think one of the successes of our committee has been when we've actually gone out to many of those communities who feel left behind post ceasefire, post peace agreement, and we've engaged with them publicly and quietly in relation to that. I think that's one of the successes of the committee itself. So we intend to engage further, and we will certainly, if you have organisations or groups that you feel that would be useful for this committee to meet with, certainly if you pass it on. But we really appreciate you coming in here today and giving your presentation. So the meeting now stands adjourned. We'll next meet on Thursday the 23rd of May. Brilliant. Thank you.